In England, because we possess no plants at present, it will perhaps take 10 to 15 years.
The Nazis made 664 uranium cubes that are now quietly resurfacing, causing significant concern among scientists. During World War II, Nazi Germany produced between 1,000 to 1,200 uranium cubes for their experimental nuclear reactors, with Allied forces confiscating approximately half after the war. These cubes aren't just relics, they're literal building blocks of the Nazis' failed attempt at creating an atomic bomb. This is just another quirky historical fact. You'll want to stick around for every single second of this, because when we get to the end, you'll never look at World War II the same way again. Scientists trace origins of resurfacing uranium cubes. Scientists today are working on pieces of uranium that might have literally belonged to Nazi Germany's failed nuclear program. Like, what? Isn't that wild? These mysterious little uranium cubes, which were part of Hitler's not-so-successful atomic dreams during World War II, have been popping up here and there, and no one really knows how many survived or where exactly they ended up. But now, decades later, forensic scientists, the kind who usually work on crime scenes, are using some seriously high-tech nuclear science to figure out if these cubes are the real deal. And you know what? They're doing it in ways that sound straight out of a sci-fi movie. But it's all very real. What if I told you the Nazis created hundreds of mysterious uranium cubes during World War II, and now, decades later, they're starting to show up again? Who has them? Where are they coming from? And why are scientists sounding the alarm? Sit tight, because this story only gets weirder the further we go. So, at the heart of this whole thing are two scientists, John Schwantes and Brittany Robertson, from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, or PNNL if you're into acronyms. These two are basically the Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson of nuclear forensics. They've been using this fascinating method called radiochronometry. Ever heard of it? Think of it like carbon dating, but way more powerful and nuclear. Instead of looking at tree rings or fossils, they're measuring how uranium breaks down over time. Because uranium doesn't just sit there, it decays. And it does it like clockwork, turning into other elements like thorium and protactinium at a super steady pace. Isn't that kind of poetic? Even metal has a timeline. Schwantes puts it simply. Uranium decays at a regular rate. And that means when they measure how much thorium is in one of these cubes compared to how much uranium is left, they can figure out when that cube was processed. It's basically uranium's way of leaving behind a timestamp. And to get this, Brittany Robertson stepped in and took it a step further. She created a technique where she can separate thorium and protactinium from a dissolved uranium sample at the same time, giving not one, but two independent ways to check the age. I mean, how genius is that? It's like double-checking a birthday, using both the cake and the party invitation. They already ran this test on two cubes, and the early results are jaw-dropping. The numbers they got suggest that the uranium in the cube matches up perfectly with the time frame of German fascists' nuclear program. Like, they didn't just stumble across some random old metal cube. This might actually be one of the building blocks of a wartime nuclear experiment. But here's where it gets even juicier. They're not stopping at just figuring out when the cube was made. Oh no, they're digging deeper to figure out where the uranium came from. Because here's the thing, where you get your uranium can leave little chemical fingerprints. Robertson's also studying the rare earth element impurities in these cubes. What does that mean? Basically, she's looking for tiny little traces of elements that can tell you what mine the uranium came from. Could it have been from the Czech Republic? Or the Democratic Republic of Congo? These little impurities could be the missing pieces that link the cube directly to where the German fascists got their uranium. Isn't that like playing a global game of Clue, but with radioactive materials? And here's another thing that blew my mind. One of the cubes they tested gave off a specific type of gamma ray that confirmed it was made of natural, unenriched uranium. That's a big deal. Because if it had been enriched, or if it had cesium-137, an element that shows up after uranium is used in a nuclear reactor, it would mean the cube had actually been part of a functioning bomb program or reactor. But no cesium-137, which tells us that the German fascists never even got to the point where they could use these cubes in a real nuclear reactor. It's like history is speaking up and saying, yeah, they really didn't get that far. Now, maybe you're wondering, okay, but why are scientists spending all this time and brainpower on something from 80 years ago? Fair question. But here's where it gets serious. Schwantes explained it so well, this isn't just some nerdy side project. By working on these uranium cubes and figuring out how to trace them back to their origin, the scientists are basically fine-tuning their tools for modern-day nuclear forensic work. Because, let's be honest, the threat of nuclear material being trafficked, smuggled, or misused is still very real in today's world. So, the same techniques they're using to figure out if a cube came from Hitler's lab can also help identify stolen nuclear material crossing borders or being sold on the black market. And you know what's kind of beautiful in a full-circle way? One of these cubes, the same one they tested, is now being used as a training tool for border guards. Like real people who are on the front lines trying to keep illegal nuclear materials from getting into the wrong hands, are learning how to do their job better thanks to this mysterious little cube from World War II. Isn't that just cool? Like something out of a thriller movie, but better because it's all true. So in the end, this whole thing is way more than just a deep dive into a dusty piece of metal. It's history, science, crime investigation, and national security all rolled into one. These scientists are taking something that could have easily just ended up in a museum case or forgotten in a drawer and turning it into something powerful, something that might help prevent nuclear disasters in the future. And honestly, isn't it kind of comforting to know that while we're out here living our everyday lives, there are people quietly working behind the scenes, using smarts and science to keep the world a little bit safer? Nazi Germany built 664 uranium cubes for failed reactors. So picture this. It's the middle of World War II, and the world is holding its breath, literally and metaphorically. On one side, you've got the Americans racing ahead with the Manhattan Project, a tightly organized, well-funded, and focused operation that had thousands of the brightest minds in one coordinated effort. And then, on the other side, you've got the Germans trying to figure out nuclear fission like it's a group project where no one's on the same page. Like seriously, you know how frustrating it is when you're doing a group assignment and everyone wants to go their own way? That's basically what happened with Germany's nuclear program. It wasn't just one team working together for a common goal. No, it was split between two major camps, both brilliant but also very much in competition with each other. One team was led by the famous Werner Heisenberg. You've probably heard his name tossed around in science class or maybe even in pop culture. The other was led by Kurt Diebner, who was more of a military man and director of the Army's Nuclear Research Council. Now, instead of these two minds combining forces to tackle one of the most complex scientific problems of their time, they were low-key in a turf war. Like imagine trying to build a rocket to the moon, but your two top engineers are in a passive-aggressive feud and refusing to share notes. That was the vibe. Heisenberg, who was a Nobel Prize winner and a legend in quantum mechanics, had one approach to reactor design, and Diebner had his own. And while Diebner's designs were apparently more efficient, yes, even the military preferred his version, the two teams still kept doing their own thing. There was no unity. And that, right there, was one of the biggest downfalls of the German fascists' atomic project. Like, can you imagine if they had just set aside the egos, brought all the resources together and said, "All right, guys, let's build one solid team"? The results could have been terrifyingly different. Experts believe that if they had simply pooled their uranium, because, yes, they had more than 1,000 uranium cubes, they might have actually created a working reactor. That's the wild part. The potential was there, but the execution? Not so much. Now about those uranium cubes, this part is super eerie but fascinating. The Germans actually made over 1,000 of these small metallic cubes, each about 2 inches wide. And they weren't just lying around in a lab somewhere. Nope, they were arranged in these creepy-looking experimental setups that scientists today describe as uranium chandeliers. Yeah, chandeliers, but make it nuclear. They strung hundreds of these cubes on aircraft cables and hung them inside containers filled with heavy water, which is just like regular water, but with hydrogen atoms replaced by deuterium. The point was to slow down neutrons during a chain reaction. This was all part of their B8 reactor design, which, to be fair, was actually quite advanced for its time. But here's another quirky detail that modern scientists love. Heisenberg coated his uranium cubes with a cyanide-based substance to prevent rust, while Diebner went with a styrene-based coating. And believe it or not, that difference is how researchers today can tell which team a particular cube came from. Isn't that kind of poetic? Even after all these decades, their rivalry is still showing up in the lab. But despite all the fancy setups and theoretical genius behind the scenes, the German fascists never managed to make their reactor work. It never achieved what scientists call criticality, which is the point where a nuclear chain reaction becomes self-sustaining. And honestly, it wasn't for lack of trying, it was more like a perfect storm of failure. First, there was the heavy water issue. The Allies figured out that heavy water was essential to the German nuclear efforts. So what did they do? They bombed the living daylights out of the heavy water plant in Norway. That alone was a massive blow to the German research. Then, there was this colossal miscalculation. They thought they needed over a ton of U-235 to make an atomic bomb, when in reality, it's closer to about 100 pounds. That kind of error is not just a rounding issue. It's a game-changing mistake that made them think the goal was way further out of reach than it really was. And don't even get started on how the German fascists were spreading their resources thin by chasing all these high-tech dreams. By the mid-war years, they were more focused on rockets and jet engines, stuff that had immediate battlefield impact, so the nuclear project got pushed to the sidelines. At its peak, there were only about 70 scientists working on nuclear fission in the entire program. 70! Compare that to the thousands working under Oppenheimer in the US, and you can see how imbalanced the situation was. So, while the Americans were racing toward Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Germans were still in the lab, trying to get their chandelier of uranium cubes to actually light up, so to speak. And when it became clear that the war was coming to an end and the Allies were closing in, the German scientists basically panicked. They disassembled their reactor, fully took it apart, and buried the uranium cubes in a field, hoping to hide the evidence. But of course, the Allies found them. They swooped in, confiscated the cubes, and brought a big chunk of that tech and brainpower back to the States. Some of those cubes are actually still around today, sitting in labs and museums, serving as these strange, almost haunting reminders of what could have been if things had gone just a little differently. 664 uranium cubes. That's what the Nazis made while secretly trying to build a weapon that could have changed the world forever. Now, those same cubes are turning up in labs, basements, and even auctions, and nobody knows where they'll pop up next. Why now? And what does it mean? Stick around to find out why scientists are quietly panicking. Allied forces seized the cubes but lost track of most. Right after Germany threw in the towel and surrendered in World War II, the Americans were not wasting any time, and their main goal? Scooping up every bit of German fascist nuclear tech they could find before anyone else did, especially the Soviets. So begins this wild cloak-and-dagger mission called the Alsos mission. And no, that's not a typo. It was real. And it was intense. So get this, back in 1943, the US had already started quietly putting this mission together. It was super top secret, hush-hush level stuff. They weren't just sending soldiers, oh no. They were also sending scientists, intelligence agents, and anyone who could sniff out nuclear secrets. The whole thing was led by General Leslie Groves, who also ran the Manhattan Project. You know, the team that built the first atomic bomb. The science side of the mission was headed by this brilliant Dutch-American Jewish physicist named Samuel Goudsmit. And here's where it gets personal. Goudsmit's parents were killed by the German fascists. So yes, this mission wasn't just business for him. It was deeply, deeply personal. They broke the mission into 3 big parts: Italy, France, and Germany. And by the time they reached Germany in April 1945, everything kicked into high gear. The war's almost over, chaos everywhere, and these Alsos guys are basically racing through war-torn towns, digging through old labs, crawling into bunkers, literally doing anything they can to find the German nuclear stash before it disappeared, or worse, fell into the wrong hands. And then, jackpot. In this quiet little town called Haigerloch, under a freaking castle of all places, they find Werner Heisenberg's lab. Yes, that Heisenberg, the famous physicist. Buried in a field nearby, they dig up 664 uranium cubes. That's right, cubes. Not barrels, not rods. Cubes. Weird, right? And just to add to the movie-like drama, they also found secret documents stuffed away in a latrine. Like, really? A toilet? That's how high the stakes were. People were literally hiding world-changing secrets where nobody would want to look. And as if that wasn't enough, they later discovered over 1,100 tons of uranium ore in a salt mine in Stassfurt. It's interesting how much they were able to find. Can you imagine what they didn't find? Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because, okay, the Americans got their hands on the goods, but then what? Most of those uranium cubes were packed up and sent first to Paris and then eventually made their way to the US. But what happened to them after that? That's where things get a little murky. According to a researcher named Schwantes, most of those cubes were probably absorbed into the US nuclear weapons program. It's like they just quietly slipped them into the system, likely ending up at places like the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where all the nuclear enrichment magic was happening at the time. But not all the cubes followed the official route. This is the part that kinda makes you chuckle. Some of the cubes, believe it or not, became souvenirs. Historians Tim Coeth and Miriam Hebert even dug into this and found evidence that some of these radioactive relics ended up in people's personal collections. These cubes could have powered bombs or just sat there holding down someone's paperwork. And here's the surprising fact. Hundreds of those cubes are still unaccounted for. Gone. Vanished. Poof! So the natural question is, where the heck did they all go? Are they sitting in dusty boxes in someone's attic? Did they get secretly funneled into other countries' programs? Are some just buried out there somewhere, waiting to be found again? It's like this real-life mystery that nobody's fully solved. Doesn't it make you wonder how many secrets from that era are still floating around out there, hidden in plain sight? Honestly, the whole thing feels like something straight out of a spy thriller. Secret missions, German fascists' labs under castles, uranium cubes buried in fields, and intelligence agents poking around toilets to find classified documents. You can't make this stuff up. And yet, it really happened. It's just one of those forgotten corners of history that makes you realize how much went on behind the scenes during and after World War II, stuff that shaped the world we live in today. And all because a handful of people raced against time to stop some really dangerous tech from falling into the wrong hands. Theories on missing cubes and black market transfers. Did you know that out of nearly 1,000 uranium cubes that once existed, yes, actual radioactive uranium cubes, scientists today can only confidently say where 14 of them are? Just 14. Like, imagine having a whole stash of something super dangerous and historically significant, and then fast forward decades later, and poof, most of them are just gone. Doesn't that sound like something out of a Cold War spy movie or one of those Netflix conspiracy documentaries that keeps you up all night? But nope, this is real-life history meets mystery. Now let's rewind a bit because this is too juicy to rush through. These uranium cubes were originally part of the German fascists' Germany nuclear program during World War II. Yes, they were trying to build the bomb, and these little cubes, small, dense, but heavy as heck, were at the heart of that operation. We're talking about nearly 1,000 of them being produced for nuclear research. But then the war ended, chaos happened, and these things scattered like marbles on a kitchen floor. Today, scientists and researchers have only managed to track down 14. Can you believe that? Like, 14. That's barely scratching the surface. And the way some of them were found? You'd think someone just stumbled across a long-lost heirloom in Grandma's attic. For instance, the Smithsonian Institution, the famous museum in D.C., they got hold of one of these cubes that was literally discovered in a drawer in New Jersey. A drawer! Can you imagine just reaching for a pen and finding a chunk of radioactive history instead? It's hilarious and terrifying at the same time. Then there's Harvard University, which also has one of these cubes. Their cube is fully authenticated too. It's like one of those rare baseball cards, but, radioactive. And the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory has at least one as well. These institutions are like the caretakers of some of the most bizarre relics of modern history. And honestly, it's a little mind-blowing. But here's where things get even murkier. There were about 400 cubes that came from this one specific laboratory run by Kurt Diebner, a physicist deeply involved in the German fascists' atomic effort. And according to some evidence, brace yourself, those cubes were apparently sold on the black market in Eastern Europe, and many of them likely ended up in the Soviet Union. I mean, how's that for a plot twist? A bunch of highly enriched uranium, straight out of a failed German fascists' bomb project, possibly being funneled into the hands of another superpower during the height of the Cold War? You can't make this stuff up. And what about the rest of the cubes? Where are they? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because according to one researcher who's been deep into this rabbit hole, it honestly wouldn't be surprising if some of these cubes are just sitting in a dusty box somewhere, maybe in an old lab or someone's basement. Like, think about that for a second. There could be a box that no one has opened in decades because it's too heavy, and inside it is a little piece of nuclear history just waiting to be rediscovered. Isn't that wild? It really makes you wonder. What else is hiding in plain sight, right? How many of these cubes might be tucked away behind old equipment in forgotten storage rooms or passed down as odd paperweights by people who have no clue what they're actually holding? And let's not forget the potential danger, because we're talking about uranium. It's not exactly something you want to keep on your coffee table or stick next to your cereal boxes. So this whole uranium cube situation is the kind of real-life mystery that blends science, history, espionage, and a bit of dark comedy all in one. It's like a treasure hunt for nerds and nuclear physicists, but the treasure is radioactive and could potentially poison you if you're not careful. Still, that hasn't stopped researchers and historians from trying to track them all down. Because if you think about it, every cube found tells a part of the story of war, ambition, secrecy, and how the world tiptoed so close to a nuclear disaster even before the first bomb was dropped. And you have to ask yourself, if only 14 are confirmed and hundreds are unaccounted for, where the heck are the rest? Like seriously, how do you lose hundreds of uranium cubes? That's the stuff that makes your jaw drop and your imagination spiral. Maybe one day someone will open an old box in a school storage closet and realize they've been using it as a doorstop for the past 40 years. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. But for now, the uranium cubes remain one of history's eeriest leftovers. A real-life puzzle missing most of its pieces. What do Nazi scientists, mysterious uranium cubes, and modern-day warnings from nuclear experts all have in common? A lot more than you'd think. These strange little blocks are showing up again, and they're not just dusty old relics. Stay with us, because the truth about these 664 cubes is more disturbing than you expect. Modern scientists worry about nuclear legacy and misuse. Researchers have been tracking these cubes down for years, not just because they're relics from Hitler's failed attempt at nuclear power, but because they actually carry a kind of eerie significance in today's world. Now, you might be thinking, wait, aren't they just dusty old leftovers from a war that ended decades ago? Well, that's the twist. These cubes are way more than just historical knickknacks. They've become this strange bridge between the past and the present, and their story, like Cold War level deep. And the way they've gone from German fascists' ambition to modern-day training tools? Let's start with the obvious. Why in the world are these cubes still showing up? That alone is enough to make any expert raise an eyebrow. It turns out their reappearance is kind of a wake-up call, a big, glowing red flag waving in the face of global security systems. Because even though the cubes aren't enriched uranium, meaning they're not really powerful enough to be dangerous weapons on their own, the fact that they can still resurface without anyone knowing where they've been all these years? That's not just a curiosity, it's a problem. Like, imagine if someone could quietly pass nuclear materials around the world without any paperwork, any oversight, any clue of where it came from or where it's going. Doesn't that make you wonder just how tight the leash is on modern nuclear materials? And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Those same techniques that researchers are using to verify these ancient cubes are now being used to fight illegal nuclear trafficking today. Yeah, like CSI, but for radiation. John Schwantes from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory broke it down in the simplest way. The work they're doing with these cubes is actually training people on how to trace the history of nuclear materials. Like, you could hand them a chunk of uranium and they could tell you, ah yes, this likely came from this lab during this time and was processed using this method. It's like nuclear detective work. And if that sounds cool, it is. But it's also critical. Because if you can trace nuclear materials, you can stop them from ending up in the wrong hands. It's like figuring out the fingerprints of radioactive stuff. Now, zooming out for a second, these cubes aren't just teaching us about nuclear forensics. They're also offering this weirdly poetic look into how world politics got so tangled in the first place. Back in the day, when German fascists was defeated, there was this massive scramble for anything remotely scientific that could give the victors an edge. And guess what? Uranium was at the top of the list. So the Americans swooped in and snagged a bunch of these cubes before the Soviets could get their hands on them. Talk about a tense moment in history. Professor Brown straight up said that this moment, this seizure of uranium, was one of the sparks that lit the Cold War fuse. Like, it set the tone for decades of mutual suspicion between the US and the Soviet Union. And honestly, can you blame them? If your supposed ally snatched a potentially game-changing element right from under your nose, wouldn't you start side-eyeing them too? But here's the twist that really gets you thinking. Despite all the power struggles, the fear, and the looming threat of nuclear disaster, these cubes have somehow found a second life, one that actually helps make the world safer. Yeah, no kidding. That same uranium, originally meant to be turned into plutonium for German fascists' weapons, is now being used to train people, like actual border agents and security teams who are learning how to identify nuclear and radioactive materials just by looking at them. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Schwantes even said it himself. It's kind of poetic. A cube that was once part of a German fascist's experiment is now part of global nuclear safety training. Isn't that just mind-blowing? And then there's Tim Koth, another researcher who's spent years studying these cubes, who put it all into this beautiful perspective. He said, nuclear weapons, nuclear power, the Cold War, this nuclear hostage that the planet is held in, it's all motivated by this effort that produced just these 600 and some cubes. Let that sink in for a second. All the fear, the tension, the near misses of nuclear war, and even the current push for nuclear energy, it all traces back to this one failed experiment. Isn't that kind of haunting? Like, these cubes weren't even successful. German fascists never got their reactor to work. But the legacy? It shaped the entire nuclear age. It's almost like the ghosts of these cubes are still whispering through history, showing up now and then to remind us of what was and what could still be if we're not careful. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.